Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we see a portrait and medals that honor the memory of a fallen soldier in the Second World War, a scrapbook filled with the haunting memories of the First World War, and a revolver used by members of the Northwest Mounted Police. Andrew examines an Enfield Mark II revolver used in the late 17th century by the Northwest Mounted Police.
Some people might say, well, it's just a revolver, but really if you dig a little bit deeper into Canadian history, there's some really great stuff there.
Gary looks through a scrapbook compiled by the son of a soldier, an artist who served in World War I.
We call them first-hand sources or first-hand documents. They're important because it gives you an accurate picture of something that is happening as it is happening.
Gary has a proud son show him his father's medals and photo from his service in World War II.
Dad was quite a man. He was a pack rat. He loved to save stuff. He was always there for the kids, me and my brothers and sister. My name is Brian Wombolt. I worked at Maritime Paper till 2011, and then I retired. I brought in 2 medals that my father, Theodore Wombolt, got from the war. There was 2 pins from his uniform and a pay book that my daughter had for him.
The Royal Canadian Ordnance Corps provisions soldiers with the material goods required to sustain war efforts, from clothing and blankets to ammunition and vehicles. Originating in 1871 as the Canadian Stores Department, by 1907 most duties were transferred to the newly organised Canadian Ordnance Corps. During World War I, the Corps grew in strength to support an estimated 400,000 Army personnel, including over 25,000 horses. It earned its royal designation from King George V in 1919. Fueled by exemplary service in the First World War, the Ordnance Corps' strength grew to 35,000 members. The department's responsibilities during World War II were varied and vital. In addition to procurement, it managed major and minor equipment salvage, mobile bath services, and laundry facilities. When land, air, and sea forces merged in 1968, the RCOC reorganized to form the Canadian Forces Logistics Branch. 50 years later, it was designated the Royal Canadian Logistics Services by Queen Elizabeth II.
Brian, welcome to Militaria, and I was wondering if you could just explain to us what you brought today.
No problem. The 2 medals that my dad got in the services, the only military picture I have of my dad, and a pay book.
I noticed when I looked into the pay book there that he started his career in the military in the Halifax Rifles. And the first entry in that book is to Rifleman Wombolt as opposed to Private Wombolt. It's reinforced by this picture here. That field service cap is a dark color, which was worn by rifle regiments, and this white metal is a white metal Halifax Rifle cap badge. For some reason, he decided that life would be better not in the Rifles and in the Ordnance Corps, because the next entry in the pay book, he's a private, so he's transferred over to the Ordnance Corps for the remainder of his time in the service. The Ordnance Corps was responsible during the war for supplying and maintaining and issuing all forms of material for the Canadian Army, whether it be ammunition in this case, or it could have been issuing trucks, or it could be issuing trousers. Until 1944, they were also responsible for repairing all of this. The Corps branched into 2. The Royal Canadian Electrical Mechanical Engineers split off, and they were then responsible for repairing everything. The Ordnance Corps stayed looking after the supply aspect of it. Your father was in supply issuing. You have 2 color badges to the Royal Canadian Ordnance Corps. The joke for the combat arms soldiers is that the cap badge of the Ordnance Corps has ammunition that's too big for the gun that's on the badge. So basically saying that the Ordnance Corps doesn't know what they're doing and they'll give them the wrong things. Without the Ordnance Corps in the Second War, or even in peacetime, the Army cannot function. And the Army is just not a guy with a rifle at the front. It's multiple layers. Without one of those little cogs, the machine does not work. As I understand, your father was posted in Halifax at the Bedford magazine. The pay book shows his increase in rank as he moved up the rungs in the military, and the last one I saw there was a lance sergeant. So he would have been in a supervisory position for a number of men working in the magazine at the time. So he never went overseas. That's why there are no other medals, and there's no clasp on the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal for overseas service. That's no different than anyone else that served in Halifax through the war. There was a garrison here, the artillery was here, the signals were here, there was infantry guarding here. A lot of soldiers that spent their time throughout the war here in Halifax doing what was required, because Halifax was an important target with the naval base here, and the Army had to defend the Navy. It's an aspect of the war that we don't spend a lot of time talking about. We seem to focus on the Army overseas, what their contribution was and their hardships and what they did, getting the glory and risking their lives, and gloss over the fact that there was a huge administrative tail that was required to keep them going and keep them equipped. That's not always talked about, especially back in Canada. You said that after the war he stayed on at the magazine and was a civilian employee there. Did he ever mention the explosion, the second Halifax explosion that happened at the magazine?
Never mentioned that.
I was curious whether he was there or how it would have impacted his life.
No, he did not talk about that one.
Everyone in Halifax always knows about the Halifax explosion that happened in the First World War. In the Second World War, we had the second Halifax explosion. So the second Halifax explosion was the one that occurred the evening of the 18th, 19th of July, 1945. The Bedford magazine is on the Halifax harbor. There was a barge there that probably had ammunition on it. It was tied up alongside. It caught fire. Fire spread to the magazine. Ammunition exploded, shells were sent flying everywhere, and it could have been a lot worse if it was not for the quick action of those on staff there and the local fire departments that put out the fire. The good thing was that because we'd had the first explosion, there was evacuation plans in place, warnings went out, and there was only one person that was killed as a result of the explosion. Brian, thank you so much for bringing these wonderful artifacts in and telling us what you know about them. What are your plans for these artifacts?
The picture with the medals and the pins,
Yeah.
they are going back to my grandson.
Right.
My youngest daughter, she's the one that told us she had the pay book, so that will go back to her, and then she can keep that for her memory of my father, her grandfather.
Yeah. Once again, thanks a lot for coming in, and it was a pleasure to look at these artifacts.
You're welcome. I did learn quite a bit. I didn't realize where Dad was stationed, so I learned that, and some things about his rank, I did not know that, so it was good to learn. I don't think there was any major surprises. Nobody came out with any hidden valor medals that I didn't know about, so no, he was just Dad, and that was it.
Coming up on Militaria.
It would be like going to university and you love the people on your res dorm floor, but you hated going to school. I think that's kind of a parallel. My name is Shara Kingston. I'm the collections manager for the Army Museum Halifax Citadel. Today I brought in a scrapbook crafted by John Mitchell Inglis. This was able to give a perspective to the First World War that isn't often seen, particularly because of its nature, the fact that it's in a scrapbook. I wanted to give it a little bit of eyeballs on it.
World War I, also known as the Great War, was perhaps the first truly modern global conflict that brought untold sacrifice and suffering to over 30 nations and their citizens between the years of 1914 and 1918. Many countries' militaries, including Canada's, were unprepared for an international war. As the war progressed, the carnage was underestimated, not to mention underreported. As the frenzied media galvanized home fronts with curated stories of the heroic allies and evil Central Powers, the narrative overseas was being written in the experiences of 345,000 Canadian soldiers and was far from black and white. As battles raged, the harshness of reality eroded the promise of adventure. Whether it was the nature of war or duplicity, many men and women returned from their service with conflicted feelings, often enduring in silence for entire lifetimes.
Welcome to Militaria, Shara. Can you tell us what you brought in from the Army Museum today?
This artifact was brought in by the son of John Mitchell Inglis, who created it and whose story it is. These sorts of things, so diaries, letters, scrapbooks. It's from the mouths of those people that we get a real sense of what actually happened. Inglis came home with all these bits and pieces and took all of these little scraps he had written, put them in his garage and just left them there. He really didn't want to deal with all the things that he saw and experienced. And it wasn't until the 80s, his son found them and started asking questions, and he realized that he had something to say that he thought was of value. So he took this 70s style binder and created this amazing afterthought to his own personal experience with the Great War. He is very frank about his viewpoints and what he saw and who he served with. It's an interesting read.
More than just the frankness, I get a sense of bitterness actually as
Absolutely.
well. At the time you volunteered, you probably got swept up with the volunteerism and the First World War, and then once he got there, I got the distinct impression, even just reading the service file, that this was a guy that really, really didn't want to be there. Inglis enrolled in Halifax in 1916 in what turned out to be the 58th Battery, which part of the 14th Canadian Field Artillery Brigade. And his job during the war was a draftsman, because in civilian life he was a bookkeeper. So I guess that sort of transcribed nicely into a draftsman, because the draftsman isn't what we think of today, someone that works in the construction business drafting houses. It was actually marking the maps, the drawing and all that sort of thing, which leads into a lot of what's in this scrapbook.
He was very talented. He had an eye looking at aerial photos, determining things and mapping them out. He was able to do that just with his sort of raw talent. He talks about finally getting to France and how it shocks him. You go from England, where you're training and you're in huts and you're being fed, and then they go to France, and he actually has this sort of aerial photograph and he marks the road. It was so muddy and there were rats everywhere, and they had nothing to eat, nothing to drink. But he goes past a street right near where he's staying, and someone had taken a piece of board and written "wipe your feet." Well, they're in like the worst conditions. He sees more joy or humor in that irony. I liked that about his reflections.
He turned out to be quite an artist. He developed a gift, I guess, for drawing or cartooning, was it?
Lots of units had their own kind of magazines or pamphlets, and theirs was called the OPIP. So Inglis was asked to be the main cartoonist for the OPIP and create not artistic reflections, but more funny cartoons. And again, with that sense that he has of taking something that is very serious and poignant and making it kind of funny, he was able to pull that off. So he did a number of pages for the OPIP front covers as well as the inserts. And because people knew him as the artist and the cartoonist, he is then approached by a Colonel Oldring. The Colonel had been approached by the Standard to do an ongoing series. The Colonel would write the piece, and he needed some artwork to go along with it. Colonel Oldring is supposed to meet up with him at another point so that he can hand off the first of the manuscript that Inglis will take and illustrate. They are meeting on a road in France. As Inglis describes, he sees him coming, he's on a horse. They talk, they go through the manuscript and what Oldring is hoping for. He says, "I decided to turn my attention behind me." So as he turns, a German shell comes, obliterates both the horse and Colonel Oldring. And he writes, "I will never see my artwork in the Standard." Like, just very laissez-faire about it, but yeah. I think his sense of humor was a way for him to deal with travesty. I can't imagine being in those circumstances and seeing people you've got to know, even if you only knew them for a couple of hours, being blown up beside you, or horses being maimed. We're only learning now about the trauma of warfare. Those kinds of traumas are very real. And for him to have used humor and, I think, realness to his writing is really important. When I really read each line and kind of digested it, I got the impression that he loved serving with the people he served. He loved his ranks of privates. Where he found the gap or the frustration was that he didn't feel that the upper echelon had their best interest in mind. He thought also that the government was pulling a lot of strings and making calls and deciding how things were going to play out without ever having fired a weapon or been at the front line. And I get it from that point of view, that he felt like they were kind of tossed out to be kind of chum in the water, and that bitterness is definitely the overtone. I mean, he calls his whole book The Wasted Years. I also appreciate that he's looking back at it from the perspective of someone who also saw there was a Second World War and a Korean War, and he was told that in the Great War, that would be the war to end all wars. So while I do think there is some morose and jaded viewpoints, I think they're valid.
Well, Shar, thank you so much for bringing this lovely artifact in. Just by looking at it, I see the challenges ahead for you because it's a 70s or 80s style photo album with the sticky pages and it sticks to the pre-glued hard pages. What do you plan on doing, or do you dare start trying to stabilize it?
It would be hard to pull this apart. As I said, this is a story in and of itself. I would love for people to be able to read through it, but we also can't have people touching this artifact. So I think the first priority would be to digitize it, but we haven't kind of gotten to that point yet. I love this artifact in particular. The son who donated it was a lovely man that I spent an afternoon with. I love that Inglis made it home, that really his passion was art. He goes to Boston and hones up his art skills and comes back and lives out his days in the backyard in Halifax painting landscapes, and that makes me feel good.
Coming up on Militaria.
You're holding history in your hands.
Absolutely. I mean, I find this fascinating. I think it's not just the firearm, it's what it represents for us as a nation.
My name is Ken Chislett. I was a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service for 35 years before retiring. I brought in an Enfield Mark II revolver that was issued to the Northwest Mounted Police. Well, I obtained the revolver through a trade with a friend of mine. It's a .476 caliber. It was dated 1884.
The Northwest Mounted Police was formed in 1873 to support the Dominion of Canada's desire to expand into its northwestern regions. During this time, Sir John A. Macdonald's government feared American annexation without a swift push of Canadian federal law into frontier territories. Instead, the expansion ignited feelings of resistance and protest among First Nations communities in the regions, leading to the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. In the years following, enforcing public peace between new settlements and indigenous communities came one of the NWMP's primary responsibilities, along with multiple civic duties, criminal investigations, and regulating the Klondike River during the gold rush. In 1920, a post-war merger resulted in its reorganization, and along with its eastern counterpart, the Northwest Mounted Police became the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
Ken, welcome to Militaria. What can you tell me about this piece of Canadian history that you brought?
This here is a Mark II Enfield revolver, and it was one of the guns that was issued to the Northwest Mounted Police in 1884. They originally came from the British military, where they carried them, and were surplused over to the Northwest Mounted Police. The serial number of this gun is stamped right here, as you see. But it was a .476 caliber. It fired about a 276 grain bullet with 18 grains of black powder, which gave it about 720 foot per second muzzle velocity, which is not very much. And it's double action. You can pull the trigger and fire that way, or you can single action and do it both ways.
Very nice.
A single action firearm, it requires the hammer to be cocked and then the trigger pulled, the cowboy pistol sort of thing. A double action is where you pull the trigger, the hammer will come back, rotate the cylinder, then fire. The most modern revolvers are all double action.
Ken, what could you tell me about the service length of a firearm like this?
Well, those guns came into service in 1882 till about 1887. They got replaced by Webleys, but the Northwest Mounted Police and the RCMP were never big on giving up stuff. They hung on to it. Some of them were still carried by members. The last known one that was actively carried was by Inspector Fitzgerald, who was the head of the famous or infamous Lost Patrol. From the early 1900s to the 1920s, there was a tradition to ship mail and correspondence from Dawson City in the Yukon up to Fort McPherson, and it was done by dog team in late winter. And in 1910, the commissioner of the RCMP, or the Royal Northwest Mounted Police at the time, decided to do it the opposite way. So it was going to originate in Fort McPherson and go to Dawson City as opposed to the opposite way. So the guide they used was a guy that did the trip one time before, coming from Dawson City, and they engaged a local indigenous guide in McPherson to take them down certain ways. So they got to a certain point. The inspector in charge of the expedition, Fitzgerald, dismissed that guide, thinking that the original guide could get them the west way home, but he couldn't find the route, he couldn't find the river to follow. And they finally ran out of food. very severe cold, minus 40, minus 50 degrees, 65, and they perished in 1911. And they found the bodies later on. They went looking for them and they managed to track them down. One of the interesting facts of these guns, not this particular one, but I don't know, was it fired the first fatal shot in the Northwest Rebellion, the Riel Rebellion in 1885.
The area that we're talking about was in the Red River area, what we now call Manitoba, was owned by the HBC company. They decided to sell the land to Canada, but a lot of the people that were living on that land were Métis, who were of Indigenous and French and English ancestry, and they wanted a say in how that land was to be dispersed. In 1870, Louis Riel started the provisional government in order to get rights for the Métis people who inhabited the land at the time. Once the Canada militia was sent out to try and quell the 1870 Red River Rebellion, Louis Riel took off the United States. He left for many years and performed some legal work within the U.S. In 1884, he was contacted by some Métis people that were living in Saskatchewan so that he could help them in their land rights, and it resulted in a conflict that we now know as the Northwest Rebellion. The Canada militia was sent out along with the Northwest Mounted Police, and it resulted in 3 battles: Duck Lake, Cut Knife, and Batoche. Louis surrendered himself to the Canada militia and eventually was executed by hanging. This revolver could potentially have been used in the Northwest Rebellion.
Yes, it could possibly be,
Yeah.
because it's certainly got the proper date.
A very important piece of Canadian history that you have on the table.
That's the thing about these pieces, you're holding history in your hands.
Absolutely. I mean, I find this fascinating. I think more Canadians should find this fascinating because it's not just the firearm, it's what it represents for us as a nation. I think the artifact that was brought in today is a good example of an historical artifact that really illustrates what early life in Canada was like and the treatment of our Indigenous populations. Louis Riel in Canadian history is infamous or iconic, depending on how you look at it. He was an individual of mixed blood, Indigenous and French. He was educated. He was actually sent to a seminary to study and did not end up becoming a priest. He was deeply involved with Métis rights and felt that the Métis people should have a say in the creation of Manitoba. With the selling of the territory by the HBC to Canada, the Indigenous population wanted a say in how the land was going to be divvied up, and they wanted their rights, and they wanted their rights respected, and they wanted a say in the future of Canada. Louis Riel was fighting for Indigenous rights in the 19th century, which in a way he was ahead of his time. Some people might say, well, it's just a revolver, but really if you dig a little bit deeper into Canadian history, there's some really great stuff there, and I would encourage all people to delve a little bit deeper into Louis Riel and the rebellions. It's a fascinating topic. I have to say, I really appreciate you bringing this in. What are your plans for this?
I plan on hanging on to it. It's part of my history too, as a former member of the Mounted Police.
Mm-hmm.
Having joined in 1973, 100 years later, but I'm going to keep it for my son for the time being. That's where it goes now.
Okay. Wow, great. I hope it occupies a place of prominence in your collection.
Yes, it does, yeah.
Yeah, it's a beauty. Thanks for bringing it in.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, my experience with Andrew was great today, and I know Andrew from the past, so it's always good to get together again with him. It's a significant piece of Canadian history and a significant piece of Royal Canadian Mounted Police history. This was with the originating group that became the RCMP, and it played a significant role in a turbulent time in Canadian history.
I love today's artifact. What it involved was right out of a Hollywood script. It got scandals and corruption and death and destruction.